Good afternoon. Welcome to Spy Chat. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us today. Our Executive Director, Chris Costa, has a really fantastic guest, as always, but maybe especially so today. He is joined by Enrique Prado, former Counterterrorist Chief of Operations, Central Intelligence Agency. Rick spent 24 years with the CIA fighting terrorism and communism. He is a paramilitary counterterrorism and special clandestine operations specialist. He served as an operations officer in 6 overseas posts. Prado received the CIA Distinguished Career Intelligence and the George Bush Award for Excellence in Counterterrorism, among many other awards. And his book, Black Ops, The Life of a CIA Shadow Warrior, is a New York Times bestseller. And I know Chris is going to mention a little bit about the book, and I bet Rick will too. Now, before I turn this over to Chris and to Rick, I want to take a moment to give a very special thanks to our sponsor today, FH&H. Their very generous support is enabling us to bring this program to you free of charge. We really, really appreciate their support for this program and other efforts by the Spy Museum. Okay, I think that's enough from me. They're here to hear from Chris and Rick. So over to you, Chris.
Hey, Amanda, thank you very much for the great introduction and the call out to our special sponsors. Thank you to our sponsors. And Rick, it's absolutely a privilege to have you today, especially having just finished your book just in time. I'll give it an endorsement when we're done, and perhaps you can talk a little bit about it. So the first story that I want to dive right into is related to intelligence sharing with Ukraine. Washington Post did a very, very comprehensive piece in talking about the travails, the difficulty, the challenges of the United States government to provide intelligence to Ukraine, but at the same time, make sure that intelligence is scoped in such a way, or calibrated, probably better said, to avoid heightening tensions. In other words, the Ukrainians cannot look like American proxies for a war against Russia. Certainly, they're not proxies. They're defending their terrain. So the United States, it seems, has drawn up some policy guidance, some procedural guidance, if you will, to ensure that, again, there isn't an unwanted escalation. First, the United States wants to be sure that we don't provide information, intelligence that can be used to target individuals that have some notoriety. For example, the Secretary of Defense or the Minister of Defense of Russia, or perhaps a noted general officer. At the same time, clearly intelligence can be provided that there's a command post where Russia is operating in a certain location, locational data as such, but not specific to individuals that are well known to the world, frankly, senior leadership issues. Secondly, the next procedural piece of advice or category is prohibiting intelligence sharing of any information to Ukraine that could give a leg up or targeting information on Russia in particular. In other words, in the state of Russia, in the boundaries of what is the Russian Federation. Again, that's to avoid escalation. And lastly, there's this general concern about targeting. We talked a little bit about it. It sounds like frankly, a distinction without a difference, but the information that's being provided to Ukraine can't look like the kind of intelligence that we worked with partners during our counterterrorism fight. In other words, we are not going to be knee deep in targeting individuals in the battle space in Ukraine. So these 3 points, 2 specific, 1 more general on targeting, are very important. And again, and Rick knows this, providing and sharing intelligence is normally a very, very sensitive back and forth between partners. That said, President Biden apparently went to the Secretary of Defense, went to the Director of CIA, and went to the DNI, Avril Haines, the Director of National Intelligence, and expressed concern that unnamed officials were leaking some of the intelligence sharing information details, which again are a problem. So that is a significant story that we need to continue to follow. The next story is about really, it's also in a sense about targeting, but a different kind of targeting. And it has to do with the CIA. And I really applaud their initiative. The CIA has instructed using Instagram in Cyrillic, in the Russian language, has reached out to Russians and said, hey, if you want to covertly volunteer information because you have some kind of placement or access, or you're just dissatisfied, and there are many Russians that are dissatisfied with the current war, then you can reach out via an encrypted conduit to the CIA. So very specific instructions have been posted. Specifically, there have been some advice for a internet browser that allows movers to move back and forth anonymously. Very specific advice for anybody that wants to reach out to CIA. I think the internet browser is called Tor, T-O-R. You can find them online. So I think this is fascinating. What it's going to generate is walk-ins, intelligence, but it's going to be virtual walk-ins. So our audience might be asking, well, how do you sort the wheat from the chaff? Well, I know Ric's been involved with that. I know I have been involved with dealing with walk-ins, individuals that want to volunteer intelligence. And there's an art to ensuring that that volunteer isn't some kind of provocation. So we'll leave that to the CIA. I just want to call out the fact that I think it's an excellent story and an excellent initiative. And I don't know if our audience has seen some of the articles that have talked about that. The third story that really got my attention really harkens back to World War II. The Belarusians, specifically in World War II, they interfered with the Nazi Germany when they invaded the Soviet Union during the Second World War. They interrupted the railroads. They had saboteurs. So a story that didn't get a lot of legs that got my attention in the Washington Post talked about a group of individuals in Belarus. I'll take everyone back to February, the early days of the invasion. Everybody remembers the 40-mile convoy and what looked like a logistic logjam. The Russians really didn't look very good as they were trying to sort through their logistics with the lengthy convoy. It seems while this was playing out, railroad and cars coming out of Belarus were subject to sabotage by a group of individuals, a network of people that have come together to include hackers going after switchboxes and other individuals that targeted signal controls, as I just mentioned, in other tactics really to disrupt the rail, because those saboteurs were very, very unhappy with the invasion and the result of that invasion being Belarus support to Russian forces logistically. So I think it's fascinating. It's clearly a counterintelligence problem for Belarus, and they have kneecapped some people. If you don't know what that is, as the name implies, people are shot in the knees as a result of being suspected of espionage. That's been reported. There are individuals that are going to be tried for treason. So we'll watch that story play out, but it says a lot about an unpopular war, and some of the individuals that are very sympathetic to the Ukrainian cause. All right, changing gears completely. As I mentioned to Ric before we started the program, an article really got my attention, and I've talked about it in the past on Spy Chat, and it has to do with the U.S. mostly special operations that had supported the Somali Danab, the counterterrorism partners on the ground in Somalia, putting pressure on al-Shabaab, one of the major Al-Qaeda affiliates left in the world. Clearly, they are very interested in someday having aspirations to go after the United States, Al-Shabaab, that is. The United States made a policy decision in the waning days of the Trump administration to pull all US forces out of Somalia proper, pull them back, and not have a persistent presence. In short, this past week, the Biden administration decided to reverse that policy decision and put forces back on the ground. Some 400 at some point will go back on the ground in Somalia to work with Somali partners. Now, there's risks, but I think this is consistent that the work that I've done from a policy standpoint and on the ground, witnessing how those partnerships play out at the outstations on the ground in Somalia, I think this is the right decision. So that's a story that you can pay attention to. In fact, I might have a op-ed coming out on that in the following days. The next story I want to talk about is something we're not discussing. And I was inspired after reading Ric's book. I realized we both spent time in Central America, involved in the same fight, him really knee deep in the fight that he might be able to share some perspectives with the audience on, but certainly it's in his book. I had a different fight when I was in Central America, but that said, flash forward all these years forward, I had an opportunity to closely study and do some work on what's happening on the ground of late in El Salvador. So what's happening? About a month or so ago, gangs ended up killing some 60 or 70. Some reports have said as many as 80 people in one weekend, a Saturday and a Sunday. They left bodies all over the streets of San Salvador. As such, President Bukele, the president of El Salvador, went to the parliament and got extraordinary powers to really go after the gangs. The problem is, as I see it, Bukele has also cut deals in the past with gangs. He's denied it. And specifically, I'm talking about mostly MS-13, a very, very dangerous gang that was really born out of the war in El Salvador. But we can talk about that maybe in greater detail later. As a result of that violence, I am deeply concerned that El Salvador's government has politicized gangs, because it seems that Bukele has cut deals in the past with gangs. And although he's denied it, what's happened as a result of that is the gangs have expressed through violence their dissatisfaction with Bukele. Now, as a backdrop to all of this, Bukele is going after dissidents, journalists, and any critics of the current presidency. So that's something to keep your eye on. And we'll post an article that I published yesterday or this week in The Hill talking about that. All right, some good news. I want to transition to detentions. Individuals that are held overseas wrongfully by governments such as Russia. The good news is a US Marine was traded out for an individual that was arrested for drug trafficking, a Russian. His name is Trevor Reed, a former Marine that was apprehended and put in jail. Clearly, the case was politicized. He refused to accept the charges. Many of the charges were trumped up, seriously ramped up to be really a way to get at the United States. All of that said, he was traded out for this individual from Russia. It gets to the heart of what we talk about each week, the idea that American citizens are being rolled up in countries like Iran, in countries like North Korea, in countries like Syria in the past, and of course, in countries like Russia. And don't forget, there's another former Marine that's been held for several years now, Paul Whalen. Unfortunately, Paul is still being held on what seems to be trumped up espionage charges, again, over the top expressions of politics by the Russian government. And of course, Ms. Greiner. who is being held for apparently having some kind of paraphernalia in her luggage. All of that said, we'll continue to talk about wrongful detentions as well as hostages. And that's the last story I want to focus on. And that is, I think I told this audience at previous spy chats that I had an opportunity to sit in the El Sheikh trial, one of the Beatles who was part of a group of former British citizens that tortured Americans and others. And one of the individuals pled guilty, and he was finally sentenced. His name is Alexander Cody. Cody's 38 years old. He'll spend the rest of his life, I think, in Supermax here in the United States, although some of the sentence might be served in the UK as part of his deal to plead guilty. Now, the next individual is El Sheikh. He did not plead guilty. He was found guilty by a jury here in the United States. I think that was justice for the families of hostages. So lastly, once again, I just want to call out the book of the month that I really, really enjoyed was Ric's book, Black Operations. I enjoyed the personal narrative. I enjoyed the courage that Ric executed on battlefields from Central America, Nicaragua, which I alluded to Africa, to South America in countries that weren't named. And some of our board members even worked with Ric in particular. Well, I won't call her out. Maybe you will, Ric, but I'm very grateful for you writing that book. Ric, I'm going to kick it over to you. People want to hear from you what you're tracking this month.
Yes, these are all topics that we've been following and that are of interest. So you mentioned the electronic walk-in phenomena that the agency has come up with. I thought that was brilliant. And like you said, we both have extensive experience in handling, walk-ins. And people don't understand. Walk-ins is like panning for gold. You sift through a lot of sand to try to find a nugget. But when you do, it's been my experience that it often is a life-saving piece of information. The amount of vetting that goes to any source, whether it's a recruited source or a source like a walk-in, is the fact that we need to verify in some form how this individual comes to this information, the veracity of his information, and everything else that goes with it. In the country that I could not mention, but we refer to it as Shangri-La, a radical Muslim country in East Africa. We were doing dozens of these a month, walk-ins that would come to our freshly opened embassy, and we had to track it down. We had to pull every single thread. And when somebody that did a walk-in sounded viable that we wanted to meet subsequently, we went into a mode that we call high threat meetings. And high threat meetings are when you're dealing with individuals that can cost you your life. So we had a very elaborate system of, surveillance detection, having the guys show up at a particular place where we already have somebody there in disguise, keeping an eye on him, making sure that he's flying solo. He would get picked up, get patted down, make sure that he had nothing on him. And then we would do an extensive, a surveillance detection route to get him to a safe house. And to the point that we even had crash cars following us, unbeknownst to them, in case something was hit, we could get away from the accident. And so that's a long way of saying that I am very happy to hear about the electronic version, although I don't think it's going to be as much fun as it has been for us to do this real life, Chris.
No, that's a great point, Ric. It certainly is. It's always good to get in somebody's face, right, and calibrate their reactions. But as you know, a lot of Cold War warriors only dealt with their sources impersonally. I was trained by some of those guys. That was not my experience, but as you know, they're individuals that never met their actual sources, so that lived with their assets through impersonal comms. So they were brilliant at getting a sense at who they were dealing with without the personal comms. But yeah, no, you make excellent points. What other stories are you tracking, Rick?
Well, obviously, we have some of the local stuff that's been going on with this murders that has been happening in schools and stuff like that. But that gets into a little too much into the political grounds here. I think that the Ukraine issue is one that is obviously for interest to all of us. Thank you very much for a very enlightening evaluation of the sharing of information. We have a casual saying that intelligence is like toothpaste. So when it comes out of the tube, you can't put it back in. So you have to be very selective of what you give out, who you give it out to, and have a form of tracking in order to protect that information. I think that the United States has done a pretty decent job when it comes to the intelligence work and the preemptive work that was done with the Ukrainians. You know, a lot of people don't understand, we did not train the Ukrainians in the last 60 days. Our special operations forces and our intelligence officers have been in and out of Ukraine since 2015. That's when that effort started. And this is part of a shift that I'm very proud of, is we have gone from 20 some years of fighting wars, and finally everybody woke up and go, we have to start preventing wars. And that calls for a lot of pre-training, pre-education, pre-connectivity, pre-vetting of our allies out there. And I think Ukraine is an excellent example of a country that we knew that they were pure freedom fighters. And this is a commonality in that area. You know, the enemies that the Soviet Union, Russia, has around their borders are people that have, like me, have tasted communism. We know the monster. There's no way we're going to allow that to come into our countries again. So it's a great example of the intelligence community and our special operations community, of both which I still work very intensively, to help our allies prevent future conflicts. And if they do happen, for them to be like the Ukrainians in much better shape logistically, but most importantly, you know, you could drop the logistics in 24 hours, but all these are sophisticated systems that need training. So the other part is the training that I am confident that they have about running sources, recruiting sources, guerrilla warfare, and all these things were taught throughout the years.
No, Rick, I appreciate your perspectives on that, and you're exactly right. And we've got to get some of those muscle movement back of training partners that are not going to be fighting a counterterrorism fight, but potentially fighting what looks to be a hybrid conflict, which is playing out on the ground in Russia. So I'm wondering, I hate to put you on the spot, but I'm curious, knowing that you've spent so much time fighting the CT fight, you're also watching Ukraine, but I wonder if you could share your perspective on Somalia. I mean, I've talked to individuals that flat out agreed with the decision to pull forces out of Somalia, talking about it in terms of being a forever war. My perspective was, we want to keep the idea of, or we want to keep a presence on the ground with our partners. So I just wanted to hear your perspective. I saw a thumbs up. That's good.
You hit it right on the spot. There's a difference between having forces in a country that are doing kinetic activity, and the other one is having a presence that you could collect, that you can direct, that you can recruit, that you can be a conduit to what we're trying to do. And this goes back to the conversation we just had 2 or 3 minutes ago. This is an ongoing war in Somalia, but at the same time, the initiative is and should have been and should have remained a presence that can help any legitimate Somali entity that we can help buttress against our enemies.
I think you're exactly right. That's great insight, and I appreciate that. Let's, unless you have something else, I'll kick it over to you. If you have any other articles you're tracking or anything else you want to talk about. If not, we'll start taking questions, and that's the fun part. We never know what we're going to get. So, Rick, any final comments before we start taking questions?
No, and I love questions because I love to talk to an audience that leaves with their questions answered as much as possible. I find that that's a lot better than me just sitting there and pontificating. So thank you. Look forward to it.
Thanks, Rick. Well, that's what our program's about. So, Amanda, do your amazing work of curating these questions with our team.
My amazing work pretty much comes down to just reading our incredible audience questions and shuffling them into kind of areas of interest. And we've got a lot of diverse questions. So I might go chronological for once. What is your opinion? We've talked about this here before of the Ukrainian effort to reach out to families of Russians killed in action and sending photos of the soldiers. What do you think of that tactic or that effort?
Well, all is fair in love and war. And these individuals are fighting for tooth and nail for their freedom. You got to understand that what toppled the Soviet Union was the inordinate amount of Russian body bags that were going back home. That doesn't sit well with any country. We, in contrast, have a volunteer military. Our guys and gals are actually sign up to join our military. That is, as you know, not the case in Russia. Those are very mandated responsibilities. So, is it? Some people may see it as cruel, but when you look at what the Russians have done to the Ukrainians, this is not even a scratch. And if it gets political pressure in the ire of some of the families to raise a voice against this war, they got nothing to lose.
Anything else, Chris, on
Nothing to
that?
add there. Well said.
Yeah, really well said. Okay, we're sticking with Ukraine. And this is particularly targeted to you, Rick. Your opinion of US deploying drones from undisclosed locations in support of Ukraine's offensive approach. Would that breach NATO's mandate if it were to, thoughts?
I honestly believe that we should be supporting them in that venue, but perhaps a more sane approach would be train the individuals to use the drones, provide them the capability, have us there in an advisory role, and having the Ukrainians do the actual operations. So there is no confusion, so there's no gray line. You got to understand that the Russians are going to use any little excuse that they can to heighten their saber rattling. And one of them is the argument that they use for going after Ukraine, where it's an enemy at our doors. Well, if that applies to us in the United States, then that means we rightfully could have gone after the Cubans. It's a pet peeve of mine, because they are a communist country. They are a satellite and a conduit from Russia and China, and they're 90 miles from our homes. So that would be my take on that technology. I think we could do it through the proxy system of training them, providing with the goods, give them the guidance, but let them do the actual operation.
Good with that. One more about Ukraine for both of you. An easy question. Could you provide the top lesson learned from Afghanistan that's applicable to Ukraine?
Wow, that's a real simple question.
Right.
Well, there's obviously been many. I think for my taste, the most important thing that we could take from the Ukrainian and again the original Afghan war, where we supported the Mujahideen, is the fact that through proxies, through training, through supplying, we can actually defeat our enemies without putting our men and women in harm's way. So that would be my spin on that. I think that that's one of the things that I'm very glad to see, that all our communities, intel and military, are really signing up to the fact that we need to stop fighting wars and preventing them. And when you have to confront a war, by all means, support our allies, but not necessarily with our special guys going in there in harm's way.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would answer it a little bit differently and say the second part is a much later lesson, and that has to do with our long-term commitments to Afghan partners, our long-term commitments to Ukrainian partners, even though the United States is not on the ground. And I know Rick feels the same way, even though we haven't talked about this. We have a lifetime commitment to Ukraine, to our partners there. They're fighting clearly an adversary that has created a false narrative, and it's unacceptable in terms of, history throughout mankind, right? The idea of establishing a pretext for war and then going after innocents. In this case, it's Ukraine, a country that's just trying to live peaceably next door to Russia. It's in a tough neighborhood. All of that said, we have to maintain our commitment to the Ukrainian people, to the Ukrainian government, to President Zelensky, and it's a long-term commitment.
Chris, that's spot on, and it brings up to mind another important point. For us in the intelligence business, having credibility overseas with any country that we deal is our bread and butter. Unlike the Russians and the Chinese, who tend to recruit for weaknesses, we always look to recruit for strengths, people that have the same convictions, the same moral high ground. But that means that we have to have that moral background. And let's face it, our history of supporting the people that are fighting on behalf of the good guys is spotty. I will start with my own personal experiences with Cuba. The Bay of Pigs invasion, which was not even meant to be in the Bay of Pigs to begin with, was something that the ramifications of not sticking with the plan and keeping our promises to those thousands of men who went in harm's way to try to resolve that has cost us 60 some years of pain because of what they infiltrated into Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, Bolivia with El Che. So our record is spotty. Afghanistan, our departure from Afghanistan has had tremendous military consequences, but also political and economic, because the Chinese, as you know, were the first ones to acknowledge the Taliban when they took over. So absolutely, I think that our credibility as a country needs to be polished up and maintained in order to give the confidence to our allies that indeed we will be there for them when they push that 911 button.
I'm going to hop around a little because you mentioned Bay of Pigs, and one guest wonders what should be our present policy in Cuba. Hitting you with the easy questions today.
Well, actually, that one is more in my wheelhouse. Obviously, I have skin in that game because I was born there. I saw the revolution, and I saw what the revolution did to my family and to my first country. And that's why I fought communism in 5 different incarnations. But the policy with Cuba is complicated by one particular item that a lot of people I have noticed do not know about. And that is that Kennedy, when he brilliantly resolved the missile crisis, because that was a hell of a negotiation process, but he did sign a treaty with Cuba guaranteeing that the United States would never, ever interfere politically or militarily with Cuba, with the Castro regime. And that's very limiting. We would have to literally change that policy publicly as the US government. That said, I go back to my earlier statement comparing it to the Ukraine. Cuba is a cancer in our hemisphere. And the Sandinistas are still part of their network. And there's a lot of socialist / communist investments being done in all over Latin America, that at the end of the day, we have to realize that is our backyard.
And I just add on, like, far be it from me to talk a lot about Cuba with Ric Prado, right? He's born in Cuba, and clearly it's in his blood, and he knows what the Cuban regime has done to individual Cubans. All of that said, my experience with the Cubans were them interfering, of course, in Central America. And we don't talk a lot about Manuel Noriega's Panama. And of course, the United States lost blood and treasure, and a lot of innocent Panamanians were killed as well, candidly. And it was a tragedy. I was there during the invasion. What gets forgotten over time, not only was Manuel Noriega a thug going after his opposition movements, going after, legitimate political opponents, but at the same time, he was cutting deals with narco traffickers. And in addition to that, and Ric, I'm sure, is aware of this, this is all public now, but he also danced with the Cuban government. There were even penetrations of U.S. Army military intelligence in Panama by the Cuban government. So the DGI, a very effective intelligence service, was also working against U.S. interests in Panama. And Panama was so important because of the Panama Canal Zone and, of course, the Panama Canal. So Cuba is a disruptor, which is why they're troublesome. And when governments today start flirting with China just to thumb their nose at the United States, or start again working closely with Cuba. I'm not sure that's the case in Central America currently, but certainly with Russia, then that is a problem. This is the Western Hemisphere. We live in this neighborhood. We've had a strong relationship with these countries, a checkered history at times, but at the end of the day, the Cubans will act as a disruptor when it serves their interest. And I saw it firsthand during the invasion. There were some Panamanians. There were some Cubans that were rolled up, some Cuban diplomats who I suspect weren't diplomats. I was too junior to fully appreciate the end result of their interviews and the interrogations. But Cuba very much was a disruptor on the ground in Panama.
I'd like to add to that two things. First of all, the Cuban intel service is pretty good, but at the same time, remember, they only have a singular enemy, the United States of America. That means that every single resource that they use can be focused on us and our efforts overseas. The second is the fact that Cuba is still very much involved in Latin America. Look at Venezuela. Yeah. And they have intelligence advisors there. They have military advisors there. And something that again needs to be told is the Cubans brag about their medical system, that they have more doctors per capita than anybody else. Never mind that they don't get to practice, and there's nothing to practice with in the country. But the biggest thing is they actually prostitute these doctors. They rent them out to places like Venezuela and Nicaragua, and they get the Cuban government gets direct payment from these countries in Latin America, and then they pay a pittance to the doctors that are actually down there in harm's way. So absolutely, the Cubans will be doing what they're doing for as long as we let them do it.
So Ric, a guest said they listened to you on a podcast and you were describing a situation either in Nicaragua or El Salvador where you brought in a rogue rebel commander. So I hope you'll give us a quick line on what that actually was. But the guest wants to know, why would the commander have gone with you knowing he was going to face justice instead of taking his chances on a shootout?
Well, that's a great story that I'm very proud of. Yeah, this was an anomaly for most of us. in what was happening in with our northern Contras, so the FDN. We had 10 camps in that border, which for the first 14 months of that program, I was the only guy allowed to visit them. So I got to know all these commanders. I'm the one that trained them in everything from intelligence collection to headspace and timing on a 50 cal, shooting RPGs. So I knew all these guys personally, their commanders and their sub-commanders. This was a particular case where the commander fell out of power. He had, it's too long of a story to go into, but he was removed, or he had to remove, and his nom de guerre was Suicida. He was an incredibly capable commander, former NCO, and a great leader. But when he was removed, there were two individuals that took over the camp, and they started really causing a lot of trouble. They were stealing and selling some of the supplies that we were giving them. They started cattle rustling in the area, and the Hondurans came to us and said, "You need to fix this." Well, came to the Nicaraguan Contras and said, "You need to fix this." Well, the solution was me. I'm the one that went out there. I volunteered to go out there because, like I said, I had credibility with these guys. And one thing that I'm very proud of is that I lived with them, I ate with them, I got sick with them, I got shot at by them, with them, and shot back with them. So the credibility was there that, people try to bite me, I bite back. So the bottom line is these guys held me in high esteem, even though these two individuals were rogues. But they understood that if they got in a firefight, chances are they were going to lose. Because the way that I planned it and the way that we were executed is you're going to go down first. And, the self-preservation. That said, even though I wasn't a trained case officer at the time, my street savvy did kick in, and I was able to tell these guys, look, I vouch for your safety. You're going to get a fair hearing. You're going to get your say. If you like you say you're not guilty, you'll be okay. Of course, they weren't.
Do you think there is a possibility that the president of El Salvador, Bukele, is going to open up a dialogue with groups such as MS-13 and bring them into the political forum? Any thoughts?
Well, first of all,
lots of thoughts.
I think that would be an incredible mistake. You have to understand it, and Chris pointed this out earlier on. MS-13 is arguably the most criminal, violent gang in the world, and that's saying a handful. Their level of violence, their level of corruption that they bring to any equation, I cannot even fathom them becoming any part of any legitimate country that wants to remain legitimate. I remember very clearly, as Chris was also, when Hezbollah became a political party in Lebanon. But you know what? They're still a political party in Lebanon because they did create the mechanisms. As brutal as they are, MS-13 is not made up of geniuses. So their political side of it is never going to be able to work. And most importantly, anybody who's formally associated with them will lose more than they can gain.
Yeah, Rick's exactly right. So just to put a finer point on it. So I think that Bukele has already cut deals with the gangs. That's a problem. He's denied it. It's been refuted. And there are tapes available. And frankly, just this past week, an MS-13 individual said, hey, the reason we killed all those people in March, this is a smoking gun, is because Bukele made some promises and he's violating those promises. So Bukele has already politicized and provided legitimacy to MS-13. And that is a huge, huge mistake because they are a vicious gang. and very, very dangerous. And remember the FMLN, the El Sal guerrillas that eventually over time became legitimate political actors. That mistake cannot be made with MS-13. They cannot be elevated like FMLN. That was a political fight, albeit I'm not a supporter of FMLN. They were our adversaries. I think Rick would agree. But at the end of the day, over time, decades, the El Salvadoran people spoke and they were given legitimacy. And they have a legitimate party. The same thing, by the way, is happening, and it's a little more complicated. And I'm not an expert on Colombia, although I'm getting smarter on Colombia, but the same thing is playing out. So that said, please, I encourage you to read my article, but the bottom line is I am concerned that the president of El Salvador already has inadvertently provided some legitimacy to MS-13. Now, he can reverse course, and he can reverse course by working more closely with the United States on the rule of law, indictments, and extraditions of gang members to the United States. And remember, these gang members are responsible for killing lots of Americans here in the United States in communities like Long Island and even not far from here in DC. So it is a problem. We just don't talk a lot about it in terms of national security. So that's an excellent question. I very much appreciate it.
A broader question, one guest wants to know, how do we calculate when and which countries and forces we train? And then how often or has this training then been turned against the US or other countries' legitimate governments or other countries?
Yeah,
Big
as
question.
as a paramilitary officer and operations officer in the agency, I was very much involved with a lot of this stuff. It is usually carried out through our liaison counterparts. And like in any personal relationship, you have to know what your circles of friends really are and who are your acquaintances and who are your semi-enemies, right? So I think that we do that kind of triage routinely. We engage with everybody that will engage with us, but not all allies are created equal. And the perfect example was, again, going back to the Contra days, you know, Honduras was an exceptional ally in that fight. They had a lot of skin in the game. They knew that they were next, but they opened up the doors for us to help them. And they were a very viable, ally at that time. We have the beauty of Jordan. We have the Tide, we have the Poles. These are all relationships that are decades long, and most of the people don't know because it's classified and it's covert action, black ops kind of stuff. But all these countries have helped us from the Cold War and through the war on communism. So it's what you provide, we provide, and if you betray us, we back off. It is a very selective process and definitely graded on a very tight scale.
And complementary with that would be working with U.S. Special Operations and having worked with Special Operations and foreign partners in Afghanistan and Iraq. And to another part of that question was, how do you prevent them? I think I understood. How do you prevent them from becoming your enemies? That is an inherent risk, that you're training a partner that might eventually be your adversary. Now, there are various things that I did, and this is too short of a time to talk about it, but in Iraq, I worked with foreign partners like Rick. I ate with them. My guys didn't want to spend a whole lot of time eating the food in a bad chow hall, which wasn't a U.S. chow hall. And I really made it part and parcel our SOP, if you will, our standing operating procedure, that we would spend an extra amount of time with our partners to build the relationships. And ultimately, I allowed a few of them to be armed against my own requirements, my own regulations, my own rules. And that served us very well. One late evening or early hours when those guys really were prepared to defend us. So you calibrate your relationships, you build a partnership based on trust to the extent you can. You verify that with technical means, polygraphs in some cases, all of that we did. But at the end of the day, and I know from reading Ric's book, he lived this, you have to build relationships and be trusted. They have to fear what you can do. At the same time, they trusted you. In that story that took place with our Iraqi partners, again, if I didn't break my own rules, we wouldn't have had them prepared to defend us, which was arming them, when otherwise my objective was to take away their weapons because they posed a threat. By building trust with a few select Iraqis, when it was time to defend each other, they were our full partners in that defense. So it's just a small vignette, but you build a relationship with your partners. Those kinds of vignettes and stories played out all over Afghanistan, not only with CIA paramilitary officers, not to speak for them, but I saw it, and US special operators. So that's a great question.
You know, an extra point to that is the fact, I'll give you an example, because we all make these after action evaluations with the benefit of 2020 hindsight. But there's a lot of people that have thrown the gauntlet at the United States because we supported the Mujahideen against the Soviets. And of course, that was instrumental in them not only surviving those episodes, but getting rid of the Soviets. And it ended up with the toppling of the Soviets. But a lot of those same Mujahideen now became the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda material for building these kind of things, including some of the toys that we provided for them that were now potentially being turned against us. So that's an example that I want to throw out there. But again, it's with the benefit of 2020 hindsight.
This one is pretty juicy. Wanting to hear about the most successful Black Ops you've engaged with in the Middle East and also in Africa.
It's an easy answer because if it's in the book, which it is, I can talk about it. If it's not in the book, my book is fully cleared by the agency. So I abide by those rules, same as Chris does every time. Even he does an op-ed, he's got to run these things by the shed. But, you know, that's a tough one because I've had such diversified, the time that we did in that radical Muslim country was very exciting and a very eclectic kind of work. I have gone, like in the Contra, done very paramedic work, and paramilitary work. And then like in the case of the Koreas, done some intelligence, you know, orthodox intelligence operations. But this case was quite a mix because we were there primarily as a security element, engaging the locals on to see if it was okay to bring more Americans into that country. But at the same time, we were actually conducting operations to try to, you know, geolocate terrorist targets. You know, at that time, like several other radical Muslim countries, they are safe haven to terrorists of any kind of ilk. So that country is known for harboring different, not just Al-Qaeda and Taliban type individuals, but, you know, Hezbollah and everybody else. So through the different intelligence disciplines, you know, SIGINT, human, open source, we would get information about this potential individual. We think that this is, you know, or a tapping of a, you know, or a pinging of a phone. We believe he may be here. Now we would go and find the place. This is before GPSs, guys. So in places where had no street signs, but we would eventually find these places and get, you know, 8-digit coordinates, take photographs of what vehicles were around it, what kind of antennas they had on the house, and thus add to the specificity of pinpointing these individuals. what made it sexy for us, and I must admit, we had a blast, is that this is a 98%, if not 99% Black country. So we could not go out in diplomatic plated vehicles, tragically white guys driving around all over the place, because we would stand out like sore thumbs. So we literally had extremely expensive and extremely impressive masks and gloves. And I will tell you, I don't care who you are, if I'm sitting in a car driving by you with that get up on, you say, oh, that's a Black African. And that was the kind of things that we had to do. We were gunned up in all these places. Every time we were out, we had M4s, we had body armor, we had, everything that we needed, secure communications. But it was a lot of fun, and I think that we made a difference.
The fun is so interesting, and I think we highlight that so much in our exhibitions, don't you, Chris, where it's incredibly serious business, but the creativity and the cleverness and how people engage with these situations and these challenges. So it really is problem solving and fun. So we try to get that across. So that's great.
No, and I just want to foot stomp the idea of problem solving. You just said it, right? The best problem solvers in the world are, in my view, people from the intelligence community and people from the special operations community. You give them a problem, they're going to figure out a creative way of attacking it. And we have lots of creative people at the International Spy Museum building our exhibits and doing our programs, like you, Amanda, and the team. But at the end of the day, I've seen a lot of creativity in special operations in the intelligence community, and we get a chance to tell those stories. So
so far my life hasn't depended on my creativity. So, I'm very thankful for that. I think we can squeeze in one last question. This is from a recent college grad who found that many Americans of her age have romanticism of former communist leaders, and she feels that is a misinformed romanticism, and she wonders how that trend could be combated.
Obviously that's close to heart for me, and there's a lot of examples in the book. Having lived what I lived through in Cuba, I will tell people that socialism is nothing more than a mask that communism wears to lure you into their den and eat your freedom. That is exactly what it is. If you look at the history of every communist country, especially when they started exporting it into places like Latin America and Africa, some were subtle, some were not, but it is definitely the transference from, we are going to do better for you, everybody's going to be equal, and that is one of the few truths about communism, is that for the most part, everybody is equally poor, equally abused, and persecuted. And only, the nomenclature, the high level people in these governments are the ones that drive the fancy cars. And, there's a joke in Cuba that if you see a house painted in the last 30 years, it belongs to a senior party member.
Well, there's so much I would love to add, but I'm not going to, because I think it's really critical that Ric gets the final word in terms of his experience, which he just shared. And I am concerned. I had just had a conversation with my lovely wife this morning about that very topic, that I am concerned so that question was extraordinary. Thank you for asking it, because I didn't know if that was just my sense that there is a romanticism, there is an interest in not just despots, from the far left, the communist side. There's also a romanticism with authoritarian leaders on the far right. So I think the world is in a very, very interesting place, which means that the business that Ric and I we're in, it's going to see a lot of work. They're not going out of business anytime soon. I do want to, we just have 2 minutes. I'll kick it back to Amanda, but I just want to foot stomp again how much I enjoyed Ric's book, his personal narrative, and again, seeing the world through the CT lens, and as well as working against the Sandinistas. For me, it brought back a lot of memories. So I'm really grateful for what you were able to share, Ric, and all of your service, and also your work with special operations within the context of CIA, as well as, you know, DOD, you know, because you were a pararescue man, I believe, and a firefighter. It's extraordinary. So thanks for all of your service. I'll kick it back to Amanda. I know we only have a minute, so you always get the final word, Amanda.
Well, I want Ric, do you have any closing comments before I do the real shutting down the house?
No, the only observation is you have a very sophisticated and well-educated audience. All the questions were extremely apropos and well put. So yeah, this has been fantastic. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Well, we certainly enjoyed it, and to those of you whose questions I did not get to, I apologize. We had a lot today, as you all can imagine. This has been so fascinating. I always learn a lot, and so thank you both for being amazing. Our next program is in real life in Chicago, but the cool thing is we're also streaming it out. And Chris and I will be out in Chicago, and that will be on Thursdays at 7 p.m. Eastern time. And it's entitled The Spy Who Came In from the Cold War. So we hope you'll join us if you're in Chicago, or stream it if you're interested. You can check our website to register for that and other events for adults and kids. And Chris has been foot stomping a lot today, so I am going to foot stomp, if I'm allowed to, if that's appropriate, for our wonderful sponsor, FH&H. Thank you again for your generosity to the Spy Museum. We love getting to interact with the public and try to answer questions from the deep knowledge base of people like Chris and Ric, and what an honor it is to do that. So thank you, FH&H, for your support.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Ric. Thanks to our audience. Thanks, Amanda and team.
All right. Yeah, thanks to Hannah and Shauna.
That's right.